the dusty streets of an old West town. The camera pans slowly across weathered wooden buildings. Then you see him, a face that could stop your heart. One eye staring straight through you, the other wandering somewhere else entirely, as if sizing up your soul from a different angle. That crooked grin. That menacing stance. Jack Elam, the man who made villainy an art form. But behind that unforgettable face was a story Hollywood never wanted you to know. A story of unexpected friendships, simmering tensions, and one relationship so complicated that it would haunt him until his final days. You see, Jack Elam wasn't just another character actor playing bad guys in forgettable westerns. He was a phenomenon. A man whose physical distinctiveness became his greatest asset, whose intelligence belied his on-screen brutishness, and whose real-life personality stood in stark contrast to the murderers, thieves, and outlaws he portrayed. But like any man who spent decades in the unforgiving machinery of Hollywood, Jack had his share of conflicts, rivalries, and relationships that went sideways. And today, we're going to peel back the curtain on the most fascinating, most misunderstood, and most controversial of those relationships. Because what you think you know about Jack Elam's feuds, that's just the beginning. Before we dive into the heart of this story, let me take you back to where it all began. Jack Elam wasn't born in Hollywood. He didn't grow up dreaming of being an actor. In fact, his journey to becoming one of the most recognizable faces in Western cinema was about as unlikely as they come. William Scott Elam, that was his real name, was born on November 13, 1920, in Miami, Arizona, a small copper mining town where dreams of stardom were about as common as rain in the desert. His father worked in the mines, and young Jack grew up in an environment where toughness wasn't just admired, it was necessary for survival. But here's where Jack's story takes its first dramatic turn. In 1931, when Jack was just 11 years old, something happened that would define not only his appearance but his entire future. He was at a Boy Scout meeting, just a regular kid doing regular kid things. Then, in a moment that lasted less than a second, another scout threw a pencil. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was the universe deciding that Jack Elam was destined for something entirely different than he'd imagined. That pencil struck Jack directly in his left eye, piercing it. The injury was severe. It left him partially blind in that eye, and the damaged muscles caused his eye to wander. In an instant, Jack Elam had the look that would make him famous, though he didn't know it yet. Imagine being an 11-year-old kid, suddenly dealing with a facial feature that made you stand out in all the wrong ways. In those days, before anti-bullying campaigns and sensitivity training, a kid with a lazy eye was fair game for teasing. But Jack developed something more valuable than perfect vision. He developed character. He developed resilience. He developed the ability to look at what others might see as a curse and eventually recognize it as what would set him apart in an industry obsessed with distinctive faces. But that realization wouldn't come for many years. First, Jack had to navigate a world that wasn't exactly welcoming to someone who looked different. Young Jack Elam was smart, really smart. Despite his injury and the challenges it presented, he excelled in school. He graduated high school, got married young to his first wife Jean Louise Hodgert in 1937, and did what most practical young men of his era did. He found stable work. He attended Santa Monica Junior College, studying accounting of all things. Can you imagine? The man who would become synonymous with gunslinging outlaws spent his early 20s balancing ledgers and crunching numbers. He became an accountant, working in various capacities throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s. When World War II broke out, Jack wanted to serve, but his eye injury complicated matters. Nevertheless, he served 2 years in the U.S. Navy, though in what capacity exactly remains part of the Elam mystique. Different sources offer different accounts of his wartime service. After the war, Jack continued working in finance, eventually landing a job as an auditor and business manager for various Hollywood studios and production companies. He managed finances for Samuel Goldwyn Studios. He worked as controller for William Boyd's Hopalong Cassidy production company. This is crucial to understanding Jack Elam. He wasn't some starry-eyed wannabe hanging around studio lots hoping to be discovered. He was working behind the scenes, watching the business of filmmaking from the inside, understanding how the industry actually operated. He saw the egos, the politics, the power plays. He watched actors come and go. He observed directors and producers. He was learning Hollywood from the ground up, even if he didn't realize he was preparing for his own career in front of the camera. The transition from accountant to actor came in the most Hollywood way possible. According to legend, and in Hollywood, legends and truth often dance together without clear distinction, Jack traded his accounting services for a small role in a film. Someone noticed that this accountant with the wandering eye had something. A presence. An intensity. That face that could convey menace without saying a word. In 1949, Jack got his first real break in a film called Trailin' West, playing, what else? A killer. He was 29 years old, starting an acting career at an age when many actors are already established. But Jack had something they didn't. He had lived. He had worked real jobs. He had struggled. And every bit of that experience showed in his face. But it was another 1949 film that really launched Jack Elam's career. She Shoulda Said No, starring Lila Leeds, gave him more exposure, but more importantly, he caught the attention of director Henry Hathaway during the filming of Rawhide that same year. Hathaway was a demanding director, known for his tough guy approach to filmmaking, but he recognized something in Jack. With strong encouragement from the film's star, Tyrone Power, Jack played one of the nastiest, most memorable villains in the picture. Power, one of Hollywood's biggest stars at the time, went out of his way to help this relative newcomer. Why? Because Power recognized authenticity when he saw it. Jack Elam didn't have to pretend to be tough or menacing. He simply had to be himself, or rather, he had to channel parts of himself through these characters. Throughout the 1950s, Jack Elam became the go-to guy for a very specific type of role. The unhinged outlaw, the nervous killer, the unpredictable villain who might snap at any moment. That eye, that wandering, unsettling eye, did half the acting for him. Directors loved it because it created instant unease in audiences. You could never quite tell what Jack Elam's characters were looking at, what they were thinking, where the next threat might come from. In High Noon, the classic 1952 Western starring Gary Cooper, Jack played a gang member waiting for the noon train. In Vera Cruz in 1954, he worked alongside Gary Cooper again and Burt Lancaster. Film after film, Jack built a reputation as one of the most reliable character actors in Hollywood. If you needed someone to look dangerous, to create tension in a scene, to make your leading man look even more heroic by comparison, you called Jack Elam. But here's what's fascinating about Jack's rise through Hollywood. He was doing all this while navigating an industry that could be as cutthroat as any Western shootout. Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s was a strange place, a contradictory place. On one hand, it was a dream factory where anything seemed possible. On the other hand, it was a rigidly hierarchical system where character actors like Jack were expected to know their place. Leading men got the glory, the money, the beautiful leading ladies. Character actors got steady work and scale pay. Leading men got their names above the title. Character actors got and featuring, or also starring, if they were lucky. Leading men became celebrities. Character actors became recognizable faces without the recognition. Jack Elam understood this dynamic better than most because he'd worked in the business offices. He knew what leading men were paid versus what character actors earned. He knew how the power structures worked. And while he accepted his role in the Hollywood ecosystem, that doesn't mean he always liked it. That doesn't mean there weren't tensions. That doesn't mean there weren't moments when egos clashed and tempers flared. Because here's the truth that often gets overlooked when we talk about classic Hollywood. These were real people with real egos, real insecurities, real competitive drives. Just because they smiled for the cameras doesn't mean they always liked each other. Just because they worked together professionally doesn't mean they were friends. And sometimes they genuinely couldn't stand each other. Now, let's talk about what you really came here for. The relationships, the tensions, the feuds, the co-star that Jack Elam supposedly, utterly hated. Because if you've clicked on this video, you've probably seen similar titles floating around YouTube, all promising to reveal which actor Jack Elam despised more than anyone. And here's where I need to be honest with you, really honest. The truth about Jack Elam's professional relationships is more complicated, more nuanced, and frankly more interesting than simple hatred. But it's also less clickable, less sensational, less likely to get views. So let me walk you through the reality, because the reality reveals more about Hollywood, about human nature, and about Jack Elam himself than any manufactured feud ever could. Let's start with the most frequently mentioned name when it comes to Jack Elam's supposed feuds, Clint Walker. Now, you've probably seen videos with titles like, "Why Clint Walker Refused to Attend Jack Elam's Funeral." These videos spin dramatic narratives about a shocking feud that Hollywood tried to hide. But here's what actually happened, as best as we can determine from historical records and the accounts of people who knew both men. Clint Walker and Jack Elam worked together multiple times. Walker was the tall, impossibly handsome star of the TV Western Cheyenne, one of the first Western series on television and a massive hit. Walker became a leading man, starring in films like The Night of the Grizzly in 1966, where Jack Elam had a supporting role. By all accounts, and I mean actual accounts from people who worked with them, not sensationalized YouTube scripts, Walker and Elam had a good working relationship. They respected each other's professionalism. Walker was known for being easygoing on set, and Jack, despite playing villains, was known off-screen for his intelligence and wit. When Jack Elam died on October 20th, 2003, from congestive heart failure at his home in Ashland, Oregon, Clint Walker did not attend the funeral. This is true, but the reason wasn't some long-simmering hatred or buried feud. Walker, who was 76 years old at the time, reportedly had health issues of his own and wasn't traveling much. Moreover, many Hollywood relationships, even positive ones, don't necessarily extend to attending funerals. People in the industry work together, get along fine, respect each other, but aren't necessarily close personal friends who stay in constant contact after work wraps. The narrative of a Walker-Elam feud appears to be largely fabricated or, at best, wildly exaggerated for dramatic effect. In fact, accounts from people who knew both men suggest they genuinely liked each other. Walker himself, in various interviews before his death in 2018, spoke positively about working with character actors like Elam who elevated every scene they were in. This isn't to say they were best friends, they may not have been close at all, but characterizing their relationship as a hatred is simply not supported by evidence. It's a perfect example of how modern content creation can take a grain of truth. Walker didn't attend the funeral and spin it into a conspiracy of hatred. But what about Henry Fonda? Now here's where things get more interesting. I found references to tension between Jack Elam and Henry Fonda, and unlike the Walker situation, there might actually be something to this one. Henry Fonda was Hollywood royalty, the son of a printer from Nebraska who became one of the most respected actors of his generation. Fonda was known for playing noble, principled characters. Think of his iconic role as Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath, or his portrayal of Abraham Lincoln in Young Mr. Lincoln. But Fonda also had a reputation among crew and fellow actors for being difficult, moody, and sometimes condescending to those he perceived as beneath his status. Jack Elam and Henry Fonda worked together on several projects, most notably Once Upon a Time in the West, Sergio Leone's 1968 masterpiece that subverted Western tropes by casting Fonda, against type, as one of the coldest, most ruthless villains in cinema history. The opening scene of that film has become legendary. Jack Elam, Woody Strode, and Al Mulock waiting at a train station for Charles Bronson's character, with Jack famously catching a fly in the barrel of his gun during the tense, nearly dialogue-free sequence. It's a masterclass in building tension, and Jack Elam's performance is crucial to its success. But behind the scenes, there were apparently tensions. Fonda had a particular way he liked things done, and he didn't always have patience for actors he felt weren't at his level. Character actors like Elam sometimes bore the brunt of Fonda's perfectionism and occasional arrogance. Jack, for his part, wasn't someone who took condescension lightly. Remember, this was a guy who worked his way up from accounting, who served in the Navy, who understood Hollywood's business side better than most actors ever would. He wasn't impressed by big names just for the sake of big names. He respected talent and professionalism, but he didn't bow and scrape to anyone. According to some accounts from crew members on various productions, there were moments of tension between Fonda and Elam. Not screaming matches, both were too professional for that, but a coolness, a distance, a mutual lack of warmth. Fonda apparently made some comments about character actors that didn't sit well with Jack, comments that suggested Fonda saw them as somehow less than real actors. Jack, who prided himself on his craft and who knew how crucial good character actors were to making leading men look good, reportedly resented this attitude. Did they hate each other? That might be too strong a word. Did they avoid each other when possible and maintain only the most necessary professional interactions? That seems more likely. What's important to understand is that this wasn't unusual in Hollywood. The studio system created a caste system, and there were often tensions between leading actors and character actors, between stars and supporting players. The miracle is that these tensions didn't explode more often than they did. The fact that Jack Elam managed to work consistently for decades in an industry filled with egos and insecurities is a testament to his professionalism, even when he personally disliked someone he was working with. Now, there's another dimension to this story that often gets overlooked in the rush to create content about feuds and hatreds. Jack Elam had genuine friends in Hollywood. Lots of them. People he admired and who admired him back. These relationships tell us just as much about Jack's character as any conflict ever could. One of his closest friends in the industry was Strother Martin, another brilliant character actor who specialized in playing quirky, memorable supporting roles. Martin and Elam worked together multiple times and maintained a friendship that lasted until Martin's death in 1980. Why did this friendship work? Because they understood each other. They were both character actors who had to constantly prove themselves, who had to make strong impressions in limited screen time, who knew they'd never be leading men but took pride in being the best at what they did. Jack was also friendly with Marvin, another actor who started in supporting roles before breaking through to leading man status. Marvin, who had a reputation for being tough and no-nonsense, appreciated Jack's intelligence and wit. They'd worked together on several projects, and Marvin reportedly loved swapping stories with Jack about the early days of television westerns, when they were churning out episodes at a breakneck pace, and everyone was just trying to make it to the next job. Marvin understood what it was like to be typecast, to be seen as just a character actor, and he never forgot those days even after he became a star. And then there's Jack's relationship with James Stewart. Stewart, another icon of American cinema, worked with Jack on several projects and always treated him with respect and kindness. Stewart came from a different generation and a different style of Hollywood stardom, but he never lorded his status over supporting actors. He understood that a film was a collaborative effort, and he made a point of learning the names of crew members and thanking character actors for their contributions. Jack spoke highly of Stewart in interviews later in life, noting that Stewart's genuine decency was rare in Hollywood and made everyone around him want to do their best work. These positive relationships are important because they show that Jack Elam wasn't some difficult, disagreeable person who hated everyone. He could be warm, funny, loyal, and supportive. He could form lasting friendships. He could be a pleasure to work with. The times when there were tensions or conflicts weren't because Jack had a generally terrible personality. They were because specific circumstances brought out specific reactions. Maybe it was someone's condescending attitude. Maybe it was a clash of working styles. Maybe it was the pressure of a difficult shoot. Maybe it was just two personalities that rubbed each other the wrong way. But context matters. Understanding why certain relationships were difficult tells us more than just declaring that someone hated someone else. Let's talk about Jack's evolution as an actor, because this is crucial to understanding his relationships with other actors. Jack spent most of the 1950s and 60s playing villains, nasty, often psychotic villains. He was so good at it that he became typecast, which is both a blessing and a curse in Hollywood. The blessing, steady work. Casting directors knew exactly what they were getting when they hired Jack Elam. The curse, he was rarely considered for anything outside that narrow range. But then, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, something shifted. Directors started seeing another side of Jack's talent, his gift for comedy. It started with Support Your Local Sheriff, in 1969, where Jack played Jake, a dim-witted but endearing outlaw. The film was a comedy western that affectionately spoofed the genre's conventions, and Jack's performance was a revelation. He was funny, genuinely, surprisingly funny. That menacing appearance became comedic when paired with bumbling behavior and perfect timing. Audiences who had watched Jack play terrifying villains for 2 decades suddenly saw him in a completely different light. The film was a hit, and Jack reprised a similar role in the 1971 sequel, Support Your Local Gunfighter. This transition from villain to comedian was liberating for Jack. He'd always been funny in real life. Friends and coworkers often mentioned his sharp wit and his ability to tell stories. But now he could show that side of himself on screen. It also changed his relationships with other actors. In his villain days, Jack often had limited interaction with stars because his characters were usually antagonists who appeared in specific scenes. But in comedies, he was more integrated into the ensemble, working more closely with leading actors, developing better rapport. His experience on these comedy westerns was, by all accounts, much more enjoyable than some of his earlier work, partly because the on-set atmosphere was lighter and partly because he was finally getting to show his range. But here's something that often gets lost when we talk about Hollywood relationships and feuds: the context of the time and the specific pressures these actors were under. The 1950s through the 1970s represented massive changes in Hollywood. The studio system was collapsing. Television was changing how people consumed entertainment. The kinds of movies being made were shifting. Actors who had been stars found themselves unable to adapt to new tastes. Character actors who had relied on steady work in westerns suddenly found the genre dying. Everyone was feeling pressure. Everyone was worried about their next job. Everyone was trying to protect their career. In this environment, tensions were inevitable. When an actor like Henry Fonda, whose career was transitioning, who was taking roles like the villain in Once Upon a Time in the West specifically because he needed to show range, encountered a character actor like Jack Elam, who was maybe getting a bit more attention than expected for the opening scene. Yeah, there might be friction. When a television star like Clint Walker was trying to transition to films and needed to assert himself as a leading man, he might have been more conscious of maintaining distance from character actors, not out of hatred but out of career calculation. These weren't personal vendettas. They were survival strategies in an unforgiving industry. Jack Elam understood this better than most because he came from the business side. He knew about budgets and insurance and contracts. He knew that leading actors got profit participation while character actors got day rates. He knew that studios would spend money promoting stars but not supporting players. He understood the economics that shaped everyone's behavior. This knowledge probably made him more forgiving of some behaviors. He got why people acted the way they did. But it also probably made him more resentful of others. When someone was being difficult just because of ego, not because of legitimate business concerns, Jack had little patience for it. Let's talk about Jack's personal life, because understanding the man off-screen helps us understand the man on-screen and in his professional relationships. Jack was married twice. His first marriage to Jean Louise Hodgert lasted from 1937 until her death from colon cancer in 1961, 24 years. Losing his wife to cancer when he was 40 years old was devastating. Jack had 3 children with Jean, and he threw himself into both fatherhood and work to cope with the grief. In 1961, the same year Jean died, Jack married Margaret Jennison, and this marriage lasted 42 years, until Jack's own death in 2003. By all accounts, Jack was a devoted family man. He wasn't one of those Hollywood types who lived in Beverly Hills and socialized constantly at industry parties. He lived more modestly, spent time with his kids, enjoyed simple pleasures. Friends described him as down-to-earth, funny, smart, and surprisingly humble considering his success. He loved reading. Not just scripts but books about history, biographies, westerns written by authors like Louis L'Amour. He was well-read and could discuss topics far beyond Hollywood gossip. This intellectual side of Jack was something that surprised people who only knew him from his on-screen villains. Here's something else about Jack that often gets overlooked. He had a deep appreciation for the craft of acting, even though he came to it relatively late in life. He studied other actors. He watched performances not just for enjoyment, but to learn. He was particularly fascinated by actors who could convey complex emotions with minimal dialogue. Actors like Spencer Tracy or Gary Cooper. Jack understood that in westerns, especially, so much had to be communicated through looks, through presence, through physicality. He worked on his craft constantly, trying to find new ways to make each villain slightly different from the last, new tics and mannerisms that would make each character memorable even in a small role. This dedication to craft is why Jack had so much respect for actors like Clint Eastwood, Lee Marvin, and Charles Bronson. Actors who understood the power of restraint, of doing less rather than more. And it's probably why he had less patience for actors who he felt were lazy or were coasting on their looks or their reputation. If Jack perceived that someone wasn't putting in the work, wasn't respecting the craft, that's when tensions might arise. It wasn't about ego or jealousy. It was about professionalism and standards. As Jack aged, his career evolved again. By the 1980s and early 1990s, he was in his 60s and 70s, no longer able to do the physical work that westerns often required. But he kept working, doing guest spots on television shows, taking smaller roles in films, doing voice work. He appeared in The Cannonball Run in 1981, playing a cranky doctor. He did episodes of shows like Murder, She Wrote, and Paradise. He never achieved the household name status of leading men from his era, but he achieved something arguably more impressive. He created a body of work that spanned 5 decades and included over 70 films and more than 100 television appearances. In his later years, Jack and his wife Margaret settled in Ashland, Oregon, far from Hollywood's hustle. Ashland is a beautiful town known for its Shakespeare Festival, a place where culture mattered more than celebrity. Jack loved it there. He could be anonymous, just another retiree enjoying his garden and spending time with his family. Friends who visited him in Ashland said he was content, even happy. He'd had a career that exceeded anything he might have imagined as a young accountant in Hollywood. He'd made a comfortable living, raised a family, and left a mark on film history. That was enough. But even in retirement, Jack remained mentally sharp and engaged. He loved talking about the old days, swapping stories with old friends over the phone, watching westerns on television and critiquing them with the eye of someone who'd been there. He maintained friendships with some of his old co-stars and character actor colleagues. These weren't shallow Hollywood friendships based on utility. These were genuine bonds forged over decades of shared experiences. When Strother Martin died in 1980, Jack was deeply affected. When he heard about the passing of other actors he'd worked with, Lee Marvin in 1987, Henry Fonda in 1982, he felt the weight of time and the gradual disappearance of his generation. Now, let me address something that I think is important. There's a tendency in modern content about classic Hollywood to manufacture drama where little existed, to create feuds out of professional distance, to interpret any lack of gushing positivity as hatred. This does a disservice to the actual complex humans who populated that industry. Jack Elam had professional relationships that ranged from deeply warm to coolly distant to occasionally tense. Just like everyone does in every profession. The idea that we need to identify one person he hated more than anyone reduces a full, rich life to a clickbait headline. Did Jack have conflicts? Yes. Did he dislike working with certain people? Absolutely. Were there actors whose personalities or behavior rubbed him wrong? Without doubt. But hatred? That's a strong word. And from everything we can glean from people who actually knew Jack, he wasn't someone who carried around that kind of poison. He was too smart for that, too practical. He knew that Hollywood was small, that you might work with someone you disliked today and need them for a job tomorrow. He knew that burning bridges was foolish. And he knew that at the end of the day, it was all just work, important work that he took seriously, but still just work. What's more interesting than trying to identify who Jack hated is understanding how he navigated an industry that was often unfair, often cruel, and often reduced people to their most superficial characteristics. Jack Elam succeeded in Hollywood despite having a physical characteristic that in any other context would have been seen as a disadvantage. He succeeded despite coming to acting relatively late. He succeeded despite being pigeonholed into a narrow range of roles. He succeeded despite never being given the kinds of opportunities that leading men received. And he did it not by being the most handsome or the most charming or the most politically savvy, but by being undeniably good at what he did. That face, that unforgettable, unsettling face, became his fortune. In any other era, before motion pictures, Jack's appearance might have limited his opportunities. But the camera loved that face. Directors loved what it brought to scenes. Audiences loved the frisson of unease it created. Jack took what could have been a disadvantage and turned it into a unique selling proposition. And he did it while maintaining his dignity, his intelligence, and his sense of humor. That's the real story. That's the impressive part. Think about the iconic moments Jack created on screen. That opening scene in Once Upon a Time in the West, where he waits at the train station, catches a fly in his gun barrel, and then gets gunned down when Charles Bronson finally arrives. That's maybe 10 minutes of screen time, with minimal dialogue, but it's one of the most memorable sequences in Western cinema. Jack makes that work. His presence, his timing, his ability to create a fully realized character in just a few shots, that's craft at the highest level. Or consider his work in Rio Lobo, with John Wayne in 1970. Wayne was, by that point, the biggest star in Westerns, and some accounts suggest Wayne could be difficult to work with, especially with character actors he felt weren't pulling their weight. But Wayne respected Jack. They'd worked together before, and Wayne knew what Jack brought to a picture. Their scenes together crackle with energy, and it's not just because Wayne is John Wayne. It's because Jack gives him something to play against, creates tension that makes Wayne's heroism more heroic. The truth about Jack Elam's relationships in Hollywood is that they were like most professional relationships, varied, complex, and dependent on many factors beyond just whether two people personally clicked. Some actors he worked with multiple times and developed genuine friendships. Some he worked with once and never thought about again. Some he respected professionally but kept at arm's length personally. And yes, some he probably actively disliked, for reasons ranging from artistic differences to personality clashes to simple incompatibility. But here's what made Jack special. He never let personal feelings interfere with professional performance. You can watch every film Jack Elam ever made and never be able to tell from his performance whether he liked his co-stars or not. He was a pro. He showed up, did the work, hit his marks, delivered his lines, created memorable moments, and moved on to the next job. In an industry full of temperamental artists and oversized egos, that kind of reliability was valuable beyond measure. As Jack entered his final years, he had the perspective that comes with age and experience. He'd seen Hollywood change multiple times. He'd watched the studio system collapse, watched television rise, watched independent films emerge, watched special effects start to dominate blockbusters. He'd seen actors he admired fade into obscurity and actors he thought were talentless become stars. He'd experienced the arbitrary nature of fame and success in the entertainment industry. And through it all, he'd maintained his career, his craft, and his sense of self. When Jack Elam died on October 20th, 2003, at age 82, the tributes that poured in were genuine and heartfelt. Fellow actors, directors, and crew members who'd worked with him over 5 decades shared stories. Not stories of feuds or hatreds, but stories of professionalism, of humor, of intelligence, of kindness. Stories of Jack helping younger actors learn their craft. Stories of Jack keeping spirits up on difficult location shoots with his jokes and impressions. Stories of Jack treating crew members with respect when bigger stars ignored them. These are the stories that paint a true picture of who Jack Elam was. Were there people in Hollywood Jack didn't like? Obviously. Were there actors whose behavior frustrated him? Certainly. Were there moments of tension, conflict, and disagreement? No question. But the overall arc of Jack Elam's life and career is not one of hatred and feuds. It's one of quiet determination, consistent quality, and professional excellence. He took what could have been a career-killing characteristic, that wandering eye, and made it iconic. He took roles that could have been forgettable, generic Western villains, and made them memorable. He lived a life that could have been defined by bitterness about never becoming a star, and instead filled it with satisfaction in work well done. In the end, the question, who did Jack Elam hate, is the wrong question. It's the clickbait question, the sensational question, the question designed to generate views rather than understanding. The better question is, how did Jack Elam navigate Hollywood's complex social and professional landscape for 5 decades while maintaining his integrity, his craft, and his sense of self? That's the question that reveals character. That's the question that honors his legacy. Jack Elam was a man who understood that life is complicated, that people are complicated, and that professional relationships exist in a complex web of personalities, pressures, and circumstances. He probably had actors he preferred not to work with and actors he sought out opportunities to work with again. He probably had pleasant surprises, actors he expected to dislike but ended up respecting, and disappointing discoveries, actors he admired from afar but found difficult up close. In other words, his experiences were exactly like what any of us experience in our own professional lives, just played out on a bigger stage with bigger names. What we can say with confidence is that Jack Elam earned the respect of the people whose respect mattered most. The other character actors who shared the trenches with him, the directors who understood what he brought to their films, the crew members who worked alongside him on countless productions, and the audiences who recognized his face and talent, even if they didn't always know his name. That's a legacy worth celebrating. So the next time you see one of those videos claiming to reveal which co-star Jack Elam utterly hated, take it with a massive grain of salt. The real story is always more complex than the headline. The real story involves humans being human, sometimes petty, sometimes generous, sometimes difficult, sometimes delightful. The real story of Jack Elam is not about hatred, but about how a man with a crooked eye and a sharp mind carved out a remarkable career in an industry that often seems designed to chew people up and spit them out. He survived. He thrived. And he left behind a body of work that continues to entertain and inspire more than 2 decades after his death. That's not a story of hatred. That's a story of triumph.